This is the true story of Mata Hari's life. In this book, she speaks about her life and the love she experienced. What exactly did Mata Hari do that led to her being shot 12 times? Let's find out. Chapter 1. The Broken Tulip. POV. Margaretha Zell, Mata Hari. They tell me my life was meant to end on a cold Paris morning, in front of a firing squad, with the crack of rifles splitting a gray dawn. But that ending was so far from where I began that I sometimes wonder if they are even the same woman, the girl who ran barefoot through fields of tulips in Leeuwarden, and the one who would one day stand blindfolded before 12 rifles and refuse to tremble. Back then, no one called me Mata Hari. I was Margaretha Gertrude Zell, my mother's Griech, my father's pride, a child of the Netherlands who did not yet know that the world could be cruel. My father, Adam Zell, sold hats for a living, but he dreamed in oil. He poured what little we had into wells he had never seen, in places he could not have pointed to on a map, and, against every sensible prediction, the wells paid. Overnight, it seemed, we were rich. Our house filled with velvet drapery and porcelain, and my father filled with the particular pride of a man who has clawed his way somewhere he was not born to be. I remember the smell of that house more than anything, beeswax polish on the banisters, the sweetness of tulip stems standing in tall vases in every room, my mother's rosewater perfume drifting down the stairs before I ever saw her face in the morning. Leeuwarden in spring was a city drowning in flowers, the canals lined with red and gold and violet, and I was a child who believed the whole world had been arranged for her delight. I was 6 years old when my father gave me the carriage. It was small enough for a child, painted white, drawn by 2 goats with ribbons plaited into their horns, and when I rode it down the cobblestones of our street, the whole town turned to look. I can still feel the particular thrill of it, the way the shopkeepers paused with their brooms, the way the other children pressed their faces to windows, the way I sat straighter under all those eyes, chin lifted, as though I had always known I was meant to be watched. I did not understand it then, not in words, but I understood it in my blood. There was a peculiar, dangerous intoxication in being looked at. It was the first drug I ever tasted, and I would spend the rest of my life chasing that same feeling in 100 different rooms, in 100 different countries, in front of 100 different men. I was not a child who blended in, even among my own family. My eyes were nearly black, my skin darker than the pale, milk-fed children of the Frisian countryside, and my hair fell in thick waves that no ribbon could tame. The other mothers whispered that I looked as though I belonged somewhere else, Java, perhaps, or further still, some warm and unnamed country of the imagination. I did not mind the whispers. I decided very young that if I was going to be different, I would be different beautifully. My mother, Antje, was the gentlest creature I have ever known, soft-spoken, delicate as the tulip petals she loved to press between the pages of her prayer book. In the evenings she would sit behind me at the mirror, drawing the brush through my hair in long, unhurried strokes, and she would say, in that hushed voice she used only for me, "Griech, your eyes hold a secret even you don't know yet. They will carry you very far from here." I did not understand her then. I thought she meant somewhere glamorous. Paris, perhaps, or Amsterdam, a city of theaters and gaslight. I did not know she meant a kind of distance that has nothing to do with miles. I did not know how far a person can travel from the girl she once was, without ever leaving the ground. The collapse. Fortune, I have since learned, is a fickle lover. It arrives without warning and leaves the same way, and it never once looks back to see what it has broken. I was 13 when our world came down around us, like a house built of cards in a sudden wind. It was 1889, and the wells that had made my father a rich man ran dry, or the money did, which amounted to the same thing. He had borrowed against a fortune that no longer existed, and the debts came due all at once, like wolves that had been circling politely and had finally decided to close in. I watched my father change in those months in ways I did not have language for yet. The man who had once filled my arms with gifts, dolls from Paris, sweets wrapped in gold paper, that impossible little carriage, began disappearing for days at a time, slipping out before dawn to avoid the men who came knocking for what he owed. Our grand house, with its polished banisters and vases full of tulips, was sold to strangers who did not know or care that a little girl had once ridden a goat carriage past its front step while the whole street watched. We moved into a house that smelled of damp plaster and old smoke, so different from the beeswax and rosewater home of my childhood that I sometimes lay awake convinced I had fallen asleep in someone else's life. And with the money went our friends. All those families who had smiled so warmly at my father's dinner table vanished as quickly and completely as if they had never existed at all. I learned then, far too young, that most affection has a price, and that very few people love you once you can no longer afford to be loved. My mother could not survive the fall. She had been born gentle, not resilient, and the shame and the poverty settled into her like a slow poison. I watched her, over that terrible year, grow thin and pale, her cough deepening with the cold, her hands trembling around her teacup by the fire that we could barely afford to keep lit. I would sit at her bedside in the evenings, pretending to read, watching the candlelight flicker across her hollowed cheeks, terrified in a way I had no words for. I was 15 the night she closed her eyes and did not open them again. I remember the silence of that house afterward more than I remember the grief itself, a silence so complete it seemed to have a weight, pressing down on every room. I stood at her bedside and felt something in myself go still and cold, like a door quietly shutting, never to be opened the same way again. My father did not mourn long. Within the year he had remarried, and my brothers and I became, in the eyes of our own family, an inconvenience to be redistributed among relatives who did not particularly want us. I was sent away to sneak, to live with my godfather, clutching a small case of belongings and the terrible new knowledge that I was, in every way that mattered, alone in the world. The end of girlhood. There is a particular bitterness in being orphaned by circumstance while your parent still lives. I swore to myself, in that cold new house in Sneak, that I would not spend my life waiting for anyone to want me. I would make myself impossible to abandon. I enrolled to train as a kindergarten teacher. A respectable path, the only one available to a girl in my position who wished to eventually stand on her own 2 feet. The headmaster of the school, Mr. Wibrandis, was a man the town regarded with great respect, gray-templed, well-spoken, the sort of man whose word was rarely questioned. I did not question it either, not at first. But I began to notice the particular way his gaze lingered on me in the empty corridors after the other girls had gone home, the way he found reasons to keep me behind, alone, in rooms that suddenly felt too quiet. One evening, when the building had emptied and the last light was fading gold through the windows, he found me alone at the end of a corridor and closed the distance between us before I understood what was happening. I remember the smell of his tobacco, the sudden and suffocating pressure of his arms closing around me, the particular helplessness of being 15 and small and utterly unable to make the world stop. I twisted free of him. Some instinct in me refused to freeze, and ran, my footsteps echoing through the empty school, out into the cold evening air, my heart slamming against my ribs like something trying to escape my body entirely. When the story came out, as such stories always do, the town did not turn its anger on the respected headmaster. It turned on me. They said my dark eyes and my olive skin marked me as something other, something knowing, something that invited what had been done to me. I was quietly removed from the school, my name spoken afterward in the particular hushed, pitying tone reserved for girls who are considered ruined before they have even understood what there was to ruin. I stood at the window of my uncle's house in The Hague that night, watching rain streak down the glass, and I made myself a promise. I buried the last of my girlhood somewhere in that rain, quietly, without ceremony, because I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, that the world had no tenderness reserved for women who were poor and alone. If men's rules had already decided what I was before I ever opened my mouth to defend myself, then I would stop trying to live inside their rules altogether. I would learn to use the very thing they had condemned in me, the eyes, the darkness, the difference, and I would build my own rules on top of the wreckage of theirs. I would claw my way back to a life of silk and candlelight if it was the last thing I ever did. It was March of 1895 when I saw the advertisement in the newspaper, tucked between the shipping notices and the obituaries as though it were nothing at all, though it would change the entire shape of my life. A captain in the Dutch colonial army, Rudolf MacLeod, was seeking a wife willing to travel with him to the Dutch East Indies. He was more than 20 years my senior, a stranger in every sense that mattered, but as I read his words again and again by candlelight, I understood that he was not asking for love. He was offering an exit. I did not know yet what waited for me on the other side of that ocean, what kind of man he truly was, what kind of woman I would have to become to survive him. I knew only that a door had opened in a wall I had believed was solid, and that I was not the kind of girl who let a door like that close without walking through it. I took up my pen, dipped it in ink, and began to write. Chapter 2. The Captain's Ring. There is a particular cruelty in the way a locked cage will make every door look like freedom, even when you cannot see what lies beyond it. I did not know, when I sealed my letter and pressed it into the postman's hand, that I was writing myself into a different kind of prison entirely. I only knew that I was drowning, and that Captain Rudolf MacLeod's advertisement had floated past me like a plank in dark water. I did not stop to ask what waited on the other side of the wreck. I simply reached. I had not truly believed he would answer. What interest could a 40-year-old officer of the Dutch colonial army have in an orphaned girl of 18, with no dowry to speak of and a name that meant nothing beyond Friesland? But I had sent him my photograph along with my letter, and I understood, even then, the particular currency of a woman's face. It did what my words could not. Within a fortnight, his reply arrived, written in a strong, impatient hand, requesting that we meet. We were introduced in a handsomely furnished drawing room in The Hague, all dark wood and heavy velvet drapery, the air thick with the smell of beeswax and cigar smoke left over from some earlier gathering. I remember standing very straight by the window, my hands folded before me the way my mother had once taught me, my heart beating with a strange, nervous hope I had not allowed myself to feel in years. When Rudolf entered, he filled the doorway entirely. He wore his full military uniform, the deep blue wool, the gold buttons catching the lamplight, a chest heavy with medals that clinked faintly as he walked. His mustache was waxed into two sharp, ceremonial points, and he wore them the way a peacock wears its tail, as though daring the room to look away. When his eyes found mine, something in my chest went very still. There was a particular light in his gaze, and it took me years to understand what it truly was. I mistook it, that evening, for admiration. It was not admiration. It was the look of a hunter appraising something beautiful he has already decided to own. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took my hand, bending to press his lips against my knuckles. His skin was rough as old leather, and beneath the cologne he had clearly applied for the occasion, I caught the deeper, permanent smell of tobacco and old gin, a smell that had settled so far into him that no amount of soap could ever fully scrub it away. Greta, he said, he had already decided. It seemed that Margaretha was too much a mouthful for a man like him. Your eyes do not belong to the Netherlands. You were made for the jungles of Java, for its sun, for the kind of heat this cold little country has never known how to give you. I have relived that sentence 1,000 times since, turning it over like a coin to examine both its faces. At 18, starved for exactly this kind of attention, I heard only poetry in it. I did not hear, not yet, the sound of a cage door being measured to fit around me. I let myself believe, in the weeks that followed, that this man was going to be my resurrection. I imagined him sweeping me back into the kind of life my father's oil wells had once bought me, silk instead of wool, warmth instead of damp plaster walls, a name that meant something again instead of the quiet pity reserved for ruined orphan girls. I mistook my own desperation for love, and dressed it in love's clothing so convincingly that even I could not tell the difference. We were married in July of 1897. I wore white satin, the fabric cool and heavy against my skin, my hair pinned beneath a veil of Brussels lace that had cost more than my father could have afforded in the last years of his fortune. I remember standing at the altar, watching Rudolph's profile as he recited his vows, and feeling, beneath the swell of the organ and the perfume of the church lilies, a small and treacherous whisper of doubt. I silenced it. I told myself that doubt was simply the last, dying protest of the frightened girl I no longer wished to be. My soul, if I am honest with the page, already knew what my heart refused to admit. This was not a marriage born of love. It was a transaction. My youth and my beauty traded for his rank and his promises, and like all transactions built on unequal ground, it would very soon reveal exactly which of us had paid the higher price. The mask slips. The gentleman who had kissed my hand in that velvet drawing room did not survive our honeymoon by more than a few weeks. In his place emerged a man I did not recognize, volatile, sodden with drink, and possessed of a temper that could turn a room to ice in the space between one breath and the next. The military discipline that had once seemed so dashing on him, so full of order and command, revealed itself instead as the architecture of a tyrant. He had spent 20 years learning how to break men into obedience, and he brought that same instruction home to his marriage bed. I learned quickly that I was not his wife so much as his newest recruit, and recruits, in Rudolph's understanding of the world, existed to be disciplined. The cold Dutch nights became something I dreaded rather than treasured. I would lie awake listening for the sound of his boots on the stair, the particular unsteady rhythm that told me how much he had drunk before he came stumbling home, and my whole body would go rigid, bracing itself the way one braces for a storm one cannot outrun. He shouted over nothing, a cold supper, a crooked collar, a word I had said too quickly or too slowly for his liking. "You are nothing but an orphaned girl, Greta." He would spit at me, his breath thick with gin, his fingers closing around my wrist hard enough that I would find the bruises blooming there the next morning, blue and yellow, like some grotesque garden I had not asked to grow. "If I had not pulled you out of that gutter, you would have died in some ditch by now, and no one would have wept for you." I stopped weeping in front of him rather quickly. I learned that my tears were, to him, simply further proof of his power, and I would not hand him that satisfaction twice. I understood, in those months, a truth that has never left me since. The very safety I had gone searching for in his advertisement had become, in the end, nothing but a more elegant kind of cage. I had traded poverty for velvet-lined captivity, and I was no longer certain which had cost me more. And then I discovered that I was carrying a child. I cannot fully explain, even now, the strange mercy of that discovery. In the midst of everything Rudolph had broken in me, that small and secret life gave me something to hold on to that was entirely my own, untouched by his fists, unclaimed by his temper. I pressed my hand to my stomach in the dark and found, for the first time in months, something that felt almost like courage. Our son, Norman, was born soon after, and when I first held him, his tiny fists curled against his chest, his eyes searching my face with the particular gravity newborns wear as though they already suspect the world will disappoint them, I let myself hope, one final foolish time, that fatherhood might soften Rudolph, that the sight of his own child might reach some buried decency in him and coax it back into the light. It did not. Whatever tenderness fatherhood might have woken in a different man passed Rudolph by entirely, like rain sliding off oiled canvas. The voyage to Java. That same year, Rudolph's commission was reassigned to the island of Java, in the Dutch East Indies, and I found myself packing away the last of my Dutch life into steamer trunks, uncertain whether I was more frightened or relieved to be leaving the only country I had ever known. We boarded the great steamship Princess Amalia at the port of Amsterdam on a gray, blustering morning, the sea wind cutting straight through my woolen coat and stinging color into my cheeks. I stood at the railing with Norman bundled against my chest and watched the spires of the city recede into the mist, and felt, quite unexpectedly, a small door close somewhere inside me. Whatever girl I had been in Leeuwarden, the one who rode a goat-drawn carriage through admiring crowds, the one whose mother had promised her eyes would carry her far, I understood, watching that coastline vanish, that she was not coming to Java with me. Only what remained of her would make that crossing. The voyage stretched on for weeks, an endless gray horizon broken only by the white crests of waves and, occasionally, the dark shape of another vessel far in the distance. Rudolph spent the better part of each day in the ship's smoking lounge, drinking with his fellow officers and losing, by all accounts, rather more at cards than he was willing to admit to me. I kept mostly to our cabin, nursing Norman by the small round window, watching the endless water and feeling, in the rock and sway of the ship, a strange and lonely peace that I had not known in months. The change came gradually, then all at once. As we drew closer to the equator, the bitter Dutch cold that had lived in my bones since childhood began, for the first time in my life, to loosen its grip. The air grew heavy and humid, thick with a warmth I had no memory of ever feeling before, and carried on its strange new scents, clove and nutmeg, salt and something green and growing that I could not yet name. At night, standing alone on the deck while Rudolph gambled below, I watched constellations I had never seen appear scattered across a black velvet sky, utterly unfamiliar, and felt with a peculiar certainty that my old life in the Netherlands was receding not just in distance, but in time, as though it belonged now to some other woman entirely. When our ship finally made port, first at Sumatra, and then at last at Java itself, the sunlight struck me with such ferocity that I had to shield my eyes, blinking against a brightness the pale Dutch sun had never taught me to expect. The docks swarmed with color and sound, deep brown skin gleaming in the heat, sarongs in reds and golds and greens more vivid than anything I had owned even in my father's wealthiest years, the tall green shapes of coconut palms swaying against a sky so blue it seemed almost unreal. There was a current of something electric in the air, a sense of a world operating according to rules I did not yet understand. I did not know, standing on that dock with my son in my arms and my husband's temper waiting to be provoked by the next inconvenience, that this strange and radiant island held a particular hell that had been fashioned, it seemed, precisely for me. Nor did I know that it was here, in this heat and color and danger, that the frightened girl called Greta would finally, irreversibly, begin to disappear, and that from the wreckage of her, something else entirely was about to be born. Chapter 3. The Shadow of the Banyan. Java was beautiful in the way certain venomous flowers are beautiful, the kind of beauty that draws you close before you understand it means to sting. The humidity clung to my skin from the moment I woke until long after I had gone to bed, a damp second garment I could never quite remove, and the jungle pressed and thick and green on every side of the towns we lived in, so unlike the flat gray order of Europe that I sometimes felt I had been transported not merely across an ocean, but into an entirely different existence. Rudolph was posted first to Surabaya and then to Malang, where the army finally secured us a house grand enough to befit his rank, high-ceilinged rooms, a wide veranda open to the evening air, and, standing sentinel just beyond its steps, an enormous banyan tree whose branches had grown down into the earth again and again until the whole structure resembled less a single tree than an entire cathedral of wood and shadow. I used to sit beneath it in the hour before dusk, watching the light fracture through its hanging roots, and think that I had never seen anything in Holland so ancient, so patient, so entirely unbothered by the smallness of human suffering happening in its shade. And there was suffering enough beneath that shade to fill a lifetime. If I had believed, foolishly, that a new country might soften Rudolph, Java disabused me of that hope within its first months. Whatever restraint society's watchful eyes had once imposed on him in the Netherlands evaporated entirely here, where a Dutch officer's conduct toward his wife was considered very much his own private affair. He began keeping local mistresses openly, without the smallest pretense of discretion, sending for them as casually as he might send for his tailor. When I dared to object, and I did object in those early months before I learned better, his fists answered where his words once had. I will not dwell long on the particulars of those beatings, save to say that I learned to dress in high collars and long sleeves even in that suffocating heat, learned which of my own bruises could be powdered over and which could not, learned the particular silence a house holds when a woman decides it is safer to say nothing at all. There was no one in that colonial world to whom I could confess the truth of my marriage. The other officers' wives spoke only of the heat, of servants, of which regiment might soon be reassigned. My pain belonged to me alone, and I carried it the way one carries anything too heavy to set down, badly and without complaint, because complaint changed nothing. It was in the middle of this private hell that our daughter was born. We named her Jean-Louise, though I called her Non from her very first day, and she became, alongside my son Norman, the whole of what I had left to love in the world. I would watch the two of them together in the dappled light beneath the banyan tree, Norman, already a serious and watchful boy of 2, guarding his infant sister with a solemnity well beyond his years, and think that whatever else Rudolph had taken from me, he had not yet managed to take this. The dance. It was desperation, more than curiosity, that first drove me out of that house and into the wider life of the island. I could not remain forever within walls that echoed with Rudolph's temper, and so I began, cautiously at first, to venture beyond them, to the markets, to the homes of the few Dutch families who showed me any kindness, and slowly, to the edges of Javanese life itself. I picked up fragments of the local Malay dialect from our household servants, and something in me, starved for so long of any sense of my own worth, drank in this new language and this new world like a woman finally permitted water after a long drought. It was at a local festival, on an evening thick with the smell of frangipani and burning clove, that I first saw the temple dancers. They emerged from the shadows at the edge of the torchlight in silk sarongs dyed the deep colors of dusk, crimson, saffron, the green of new rice, with golden crowns rising from their oiled black hair like the towers of some miniature palace. When the gamelan music began, all bronze and chiming and unlike any music my European ears had ever known, the dancers did not simply move. They spoke with their bodies in a language I had no words for yet, their fingers curling backward at impossible angles, their eyes sliding sideways beneath painted lids, their necks tilting with a precision so exact it seemed less like performance than incantation. I stood at the edge of that crowd and felt something inside my chest crack open. This was not entertainment, I understood watching them. This was devotion. Each gesture told a story lifted from some ancient epic I did not yet know by name, each movement of wrist and hip and eye a kind of prayer offered not to any audience, but to the gods themselves. And as I watched those women move through the torchlight, utterly absorbed in their own sacred performance, I thought, with a longing so sharp it frightened me, that they looked, for those brief hours, entirely free. No husband's fist could reach a woman who had gone that far inside herself. No man's rage could follow her into that other world she had built from nothing but silk and gesture and belief. I began to study it in secret. I bought sarongs of my own from the market women, wound them about myself exactly as I had watched the dancers do, and stood before my mirror in the hour before Rudolph returned, practicing the slow curl of my fingers, the deliberate roll of my wrist, the particular stillness of the neck that made the whole body seem to float rather than move. At first I felt foolish, a pale Dutch wife playing at something that did not belong to her. But something in the repetition began, slowly, to change me. When I raised my arms in that mirror and let my eyes drift half-closed the way the temple dancers did, I no longer saw Rudolph MacLeod's beaten, silent wife looking back at me. I saw someone else entirely, someone I had not yet found the courage to become, but whose outline I could feel, faintly, beginning to take shape. It was during those months that I first heard the words that would one day replace my own name entirely. Mata Hari, eye of the day, the sun itself, in the local tongue. I remember repeating it under my breath, alone on the veranda in the blue hour before dawn, and feeling a strange conviction settle over me, quiet but absolute. Someday, I told myself, this sun will rise over the whole world, and no man will ever again be able to look directly at it without being burned. I did not yet know how soon, and how cruelly, that private hope would be tested. The blackest night. Fate, I have come to believe, does not permit a woman even a small mercy without demanding some far greater payment in return. In the year 1899, on a night I have relived 1,000 times since and have never once been able to soften in the retelling, my world was destroyed beyond any repair. It happened without warning, the way the worst things always seem to. Past midnight, both of my children, Norman, not yet 3, and little Non, barely more than an infant, began to cry out in a way I had never heard from them before, a thin, terrible sound that brought me from my bed before I was even fully awake. By the time I reached the nursery, they were both retching violently, their small bodies convulsing, a pale foam gathering at the corners of their mouths. I remember screaming for the servants, for anyone, my hands shaking too badly to hold either child steady, the whole house filling with a chaos of running feet and shouted orders that I could not, even now, arrange into any coherent memory. A doctor was sent for, but the roads from Malong were long, and by the time he arrived, the worst had already happened. It emerged, in the terrible days that followed, that one of our household servants, driven, it was said, to some private vengeance by Rudolph's brutality toward the staff as much as toward me, had put poison into the children's food. None survived, though it was many days before anyone could say so with any certainty. Norman did not. My son, my beautiful, solemn, watchful boy of 2.5 years, who had guarded his baby sister beneath the banyan tree with such fierce and tender seriousness, grew still in my arms some time before dawn, his small body finally surrendering to whatever poison had been working through it all that endless night. I do not have words. Even now, even in this account I am setting down so many years later, for the particular silence that follows a child's last breath. I have known grief many times since in my life, but I have never again known anything quite like the hollowing out of that one single night, when I understood, in the space of a few hours, exactly how much a heart is capable of losing all at once. I am told my screams that night were loud enough to shake the leaves of the banyan tree itself. I do not remember screaming. I remember only Norman's weight in my arms, growing lighter somehow even as it grew heavier, and the terrible stillness of his small hands. They buried him in a small white coffin in the cemetery at Malong, beneath a sky so blue and indifferent it seemed almost an insult. I stood at the edge of that raw, wet earth in my black mourning dress, Non held tightly against my chest as though I might lose her too if my grip ever once loosened, and I looked across the grave at Rudolph. There was no grief in his face. I searched for it, some flicker of the man who had once, however briefly, held his newborn son and seemed almost moved by the sight of him, and found nothing there but a strange, glassy fury, the look of a man already searching for someone else to blame. He found what he was looking for easily enough. Within days, he had begun telling anyone who would listen that the fault for Norman's death lay somehow with me, my inattention, my absences, my failures as a mother, as though grief itself were a debt that could be transferred from his ledger to mine. Standing over that wet grave, I understood something with a clarity that has never once wavered since. Whatever had existed between Rudolph MacLeod and myself, whatever thin thread of obligation or fear or habit had bound me to him, had been buried that day alongside my son. There was nothing left between us worth saving. And if I remained in that house, beneath that banyan tree, within reach of his fists and his blame, I understood that this private hell would not stop with Norman. It would come, eventually, for Non as well, and then for whatever remained of me. I made myself a second vow that day, standing over freshly turned earth with my daughter clutched against my chest. I would not wait for that day to arrive. Whatever it cost me, my safety, my reputation, every last fragment of the respectable life I had once imagined for myself, I would find a way to take my daughter and run from this place, before this island's cruelty finished what it had already begun. Chapter 4. The Golden Cage of Paris. After Norman's death, Java ceased to be a country and became instead a single vast graveyard that happened to have a climate. I could not walk beneath the banyan tree without seeing his small coffin lowered into that raw earth, could not pass the nursery without hearing, in memory, the particular silence that follows a child's last breath. Rudolph's cruelty, which I had once believed could not grow any sharper, sharpened anyway, honed now by grief he refused to feel for himself and was determined instead to make me carry alone. By 1902, I understood that if I remained on that island one season longer, it would finish what it had already begun. We returned to the Netherlands, husks of whatever we had once pretended to be to each other, and I resolved, at last, to end the marriage entirely. I do not think I understood, filing those separation papers in a cold Dutch courtroom, quite how thoroughly Rudolph intended to make me pay for my freedom. The court granted me custody of Non, my one remaining child, and for a brief, foolish season I believed that this single mercy might be enough to build a life upon. But Rudolph was a resourceful man where cruelty was concerned, far more resourceful than he had ever been as a husband or a father, and he refused outright to provide a single guilder toward our support. I found myself without a roof I could call my own, without money enough to keep my daughter properly fed, reduced to a poverty crueler than anything I had known even after my own father's ruin, because now there was a child's hunger bound up in it, as well as my own. And then, on a day I had gone out searching desperately for work, Rudolph took her. He seized Non by force and carried her away, and when I went to the house where he had installed himself, he refused even to let me through the door to see my own daughter's face. I went to the law, certain that no court could possibly countenance such a thing, and found instead that the law had been fashioned entirely by men, for men, and that a woman without money or reputation had no standing to challenge it. They told me, in effect, that an orphaned, penniless woman with a scandal already trailing her name had nothing worthwhile to offer a child's future, as though poverty were a moral failing rather than simply the wreckage men like Rudolph left behind them. Leaving my daughter behind was the second great wound of my life, and I have never fully closed it, not in all the years since. I remember standing on the platform of a Dutch railway station, the whistle of the departing train shrieking through the cold air, and wiping the tears from my eyes with a gloved hand because I could not afford, even in that moment, to let the world see me break. I had nothing left to lose by then. No mother, no son, no husband worth the name, and now no daughter to hold. It was in that particular emptiness, the emptiness of a woman who has already survived every ruin a life can offer her, that I made the decision that would remake me entirely. I would go to Paris. That city of art and hunger and unapologetic beauty would either take me in, or it would finish erasing whatever remained of Margaretha Zell. I found, standing on that platform with nothing left to protect, that I no longer feared either outcome. The city that devours. I stepped off the train at the Gare du Nord in the last months of 1903 into a bitter, biting cold, my breath clouding in the air, the Seine wrapped in a fog so thick it seemed to swallow the bridges whole. I had perhaps a handful of francs to my name and no acquaintance in the entire city who might offer me a bed. Paris, I learned quickly, was every bit as merciless up close as it was glittering from a distance, a city that would applaud a woman's beauty in its salons at night and let her starve quietly in its gutters by morning, without ever once considering the two things in contradiction. I spent those first months in a poverty deeper than any I had known even after my father's bankruptcy. I found work, when I could find it at all, riding horses bareback in a small circus under the stage named Lady MacLeod, trading on the last fading credibility of a marriage I had already buried in every way that mattered. When even that failed to fill my stomach, I sat for painters as a nude model, holding perfectly still for hours in unheated studios while men who would never remember my face sketched the particular curve of my shoulder, my hip, my collarbone, and paid me just enough to keep myself fed another few days. I will not pretend those months held any romance in the living of them. There was cold, and there was hunger, and there were nights in rented rooms so thin-walled I could hear every argument, every cough, every small tragedy of my neighbors as clearly as if it were happening in my own bed. But it was in the depths of those wretched Parisian nights, sitting alone in rooms that smelled of damp plaster and cheap tallow candles, that I found myself returning again and again in memory to the temple dancers of Java, to the particular grace of their curling fingers, to the sacred stillness of their painted eyes, to that name I had once whispered to myself alone on a veranda in Milan. Mata Hari, eye of the day. I understood something in those cold rooms that I do not believe any other woman in Paris understood quite so clearly. Not yet. The wealthy men of that city, the bankers, the ministers, the generals who filled its opera boxes and its private clubs, did not merely want a beautiful body. Paris had beautiful bodies in abundance, on every corner, for a price. What those men truly hungered for was a mystery, a story they had never heard before, something exotic enough to make their comfortable, well-ordered lives feel, for a single evening, dangerous. And so, in the privacy of my own mind, I buried Margaretha Zell for the final time. I let that grieving, penniless Dutch orphan sink quietly into the mud of the Seine's fog, and in her place, I began, piece by careful piece, to construct someone else entirely. I told Paris's most powerful men that I had been born in the temples of southern India, the daughter of a sacred dancer who had died bringing me into the world, and that I had been raised from infancy by priests who had taught me the ancient, holy dances of the East, dances no Western eye had ever before been permitted to witness. It was, every word of it, a beautiful lie. But I had learned, at great cost, that the truth had never once been kind to me, and I decided that if I must build a life from nothing, I would at least build it from a story magnificent enough to be worth the telling. The 13th of March. The 13th of March, in the year 1905, is a date I have never once needed to consult a calendar to recall. It arrived etched into me the way a brand is etched into skin, permanent, deliberate, and entirely transformative. The Musée Guémet, Paris's great museum of Asian art, opened its grand hall to me that evening for what would become my first true performance before the city that had nearly broken me. The room filled with the very men who had, only months before, walked past me on the street without a second glance, bankers in tailored black, ministers with medals not unlike Rudolph's own pinned to their chests, journalists sharpening their pencils in anticipation of a story they did not yet know how remarkable it would be. The air hung thick with the mingled scent of expensive perfume and cigar smoke, candlelight glinting off crystal and gold, a hush of anticipation settling over the hall like the moment before a held breath is finally released. I remember standing in the shadows just beyond the edge of that candlelight, my heart beating so hard I feared the whole room might hear it, my hands trembling faintly beneath the weight of a jeweled Indian headdress I had spent my last resources acquiring. Beneath it, my body was wrapped in sarongs of such fine, near-translucent silk that they seemed less like garments than like mist given form. I thought, in that final moment before the music began, of my daughter's face, of Norman's small stilled hands, of every bruise Rudolph had ever left upon my skin, and every door that had ever been closed against me by men who believed they had the right. I let all of it rise up inside me, not as sorrow now, but as something far more dangerous, as fuel. When the gamelan music began, a sound so foreign to that grand Parisian hall that I watched the whole room lean forward as one, I stepped into the light. I do not fully know how to describe, even now, what happened in the hour that followed. I moved as I had taught myself to move before a cracked mirror in a Javanese bedroom years before, my fingers curling backward with the same deliberate grace, my hips finding that slow, hypnotic roll I had studied so hungrily beneath the banyan's shadow, my eyes sliding half-closed with all the practiced mystery of a woman who has learned that what a man cannot fully see, he will spend a fortune trying to uncover. I danced the fury of every year Rudolph had stolen from me. I danced the grief of a son I could not save and a daughter I was not permitted to hold. And as the music built toward its final, trembling crescendo, I let the silk sarongs fall from my shoulders, one by one, into the candlelit air, until I stood before that entire hall of Paris's most powerful men in nothing but a jeweled metal breastplate and my own unshaking gaze. It was not merely a dance. It was my triumph laid bare over every man who had ever believed he held power over me. When the music finally stopped, the great hall fell utterly silent. A silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could hear the faint hiss of the candles burning down in their sconces. For one endless, terrifying moment, I did not know whether I had conquered that room or destroyed myself entirely within it. And then the applause broke over me like a wave against a seawall, thunderous enough that I felt it in the floorboards beneath my bare feet, a sound so overwhelming it seemed to shake the very foundations of that grand old museum. By the following morning, every newspaper in Paris carried a single name across its pages, printed in ink still damp with the excitement of a city that believed it had discovered something entirely new beneath its own sun. Mata Hari, the Eye of the Dawn. Overnight, the woman who had gone to bed hungry in rented rooms, who had ridden horses bareback for coins and sat shivering for painters who never learned her true name, ceased to exist. In her place stood the most sought-after, most whispered about, most desired woman in all of Paris. Kings, Bankers and generals who would once have walked past me without a second glance now waited, hats in hand, for the smallest fraction of my attention. I had built, from nothing but grief and silk and a stolen name, a golden cage of my very own, and I stepped into it willingly, believing, in my triumph, that I had finally learned how to make a cage serve me rather than the other way around. I did not yet understand how much that particular lesson would still cost me before the story was through. Chapter 5. Lovers and Kings. That single night at the Musée Guémet split my life cleanly into a before and an after, the way a river splits a valley it has spent centuries carving. I was no longer merely a dancer to be booked and paid and forgotten by morning. I had become something Paris had decided to worship, and worship, I learned very quickly, pays considerably better than mere admiration ever could. Within the year, I possessed more wealth than I had known even in the brief, gilded season of my father's oil fortune. I kept a magnificent villa just off the Champs-Élysées, its rooms hung with silk and lit by crystal chandeliers that scattered candlelight like scattered diamonds across the parquet floors. My stables held some of the finest horses in all of Paris, groomed and gleaming, harnessed to carriages that turned heads on the Bois de Boulogne. The girl who had once wept over a single franc now slept beneath sheets of the most expensive silk Europe's looms could produce, and there was, I will admit, a certain bitter satisfaction in that particular reversal of fortune. And yet, beneath all that glittering surface lay a truth I permitted almost no one to glimpse. The woman Paris adored as Mata Hari was, in the truest sense, an illusion, a story I had constructed with the same deliberate care a jeweler gives to a particularly valuable stone, cut and polished to catch the light from every angle a man might wish to view it from. When I danced upon that stage, draped in translucent silk and jeweled metal, the men who filled those velvet seats were not truly looking at my body at all. They were looking at the story I had woven around it, a sacred temple dancer born beneath some distant, impossible sun, orphaned by tragedy, initiated into mysteries no Western I had ever been permitted to witness. I took a particular private pride in that deception. I had taken my own dark eyes, my own foreign difference, the very features that had once made me an outcast in a Frisian schoolyard, and fused them with the borrowed grace of Javanese temple dance until I had fashioned something no other woman in Europe could offer. I had made an entire continent fall in love with a lie of my own careful design. The company of powerful men. It was not long before my world extended well beyond the footlights of any single theater. The wealthiest bankers of Europe began finding reasons to call at my villa. Military generals, resplendent in their decorated uniforms, waited in my drawing room the way lesser men wait outside a physician's office, patient and faintly desperate. Princes of royal houses I had once only read about in newspapers sent their calling cards round with hands that trembled, however slightly, at the prospect of my attention. Before long, France's own Minister of War had become a frequent visitor to my bedroom, as had wealthy German landowners and diplomats from half a dozen nations whose names I had once struggled even to pronounce. They showered me with gifts the way pilgrims leave offerings at a shrine, diamonds cold and heavy in their velvet boxes, gilded cases meant for jewels I had not yet been given, thousands of francs pressed into my hand with a kind of reverent urgency. I understood precisely what they were purchasing, and it was not merely an evening in my company. It was the right to whisper, in their private clubs and officers' messes, that the most desired woman in the world slept in their arms and no one else's, if only, in their own minds, for that single night. Their vanity, I discovered, was the sharpest weapon I had ever been handed. I had learned, in the wreckage Rudolph left of my first marriage, that a woman who places her trust in a man's protection will very often find herself betrayed by the very hands she believed were shielding her. I resolved, lying awake in that Javanese darkness so many years before, that I would never again make that particular mistake. Men, I had come to understand, were not to be trusted. They were to be used carefully and without sentiment, the way a locksmith uses a particular tool for a particular lock. And when these powerful men lay beside me in the dim hours after midnight, their guards lowered by wine and desire and the particular vanity of believing themselves adored, they spoke of their armies, their ministries, their nation's most guarded secrets as freely as a child confessing some small mischief to an indulgent mother. I did not yet understand, in those glittering years, precisely how dangerous that particular habit of theirs would one day become for me. I only understood, then, that it made me powerful in a way no jewel or franc note ever could. The hollow hours. The world believed that Mata Hari possessed everything a woman could ever wish to hold. In certain hours, watching the candlelight glint off a new diamond or hearing my own name shouted in adoration from an opera house balcony, I nearly believed it myself. But there is a particular loneliness that arrives only after the lights have gone down and the powerful men have returned to their own wives and their own beds, leaving a woman alone in a villa too large and too silent to fill with anything but memory. I would sit before my mirror in those late hours, wiping away the thick paint and kohl that transformed my face into the mask Paris adored, and watch, with a kind of quiet grief, as Mata Hari dissolved beneath the cold cream and the candlelight revealed, once again, only Greta, that same frightened, orphaned Dutch girl who had once believed a captain's uniform might save her from an unkind world. It was in those hollow hours that I thought most often of Non. I spent a considerable fortune on the finest lawyers France could offer, pouring money into their retainers the way another woman might pour it into jewels, all in the desperate hope that some clever legal maneuver might finally pry my daughter loose from Rudolph's grip. But Dutch law, I learned again and again, had been written entirely by men for the protection of men, and it sided with that cruel father at every turn no matter how much gold I offered in argument against him. Rudolph, in his particular genius for inflicting pain, burned every letter I sent to her before Non could ever read a single word of her mother's love, and ensured, with a thoroughness that still chills me to recall, that his daughter grew to believe I had simply abandoned her by choice. When that particular grief threatened to split me open entirely, I did what I had always done since the night I buried my mother. I drowned it beneath activity, beneath spectacle, beneath the endless glittering distraction of a life lived always in motion. I traveled from the salons of Paris to the opera houses of Berlin, from Berlin to the grand ballrooms of Vienna, from Vienna onward to Madrid, and in every city I found the same worshipful crowds waiting, the same powerful men eager to press their fortunes and their secrets into my open hands. Every opera house in Europe, it seemed, knew how to say my name. The gathering storm. By the years 1912 and 1913, I began to notice something shifting beneath the surface of that gilded European world I had made my home. A bitterness creeping into conversations that had once been only flirtation, a tension that hung in ballrooms the way smoke lingers after a fire, has been put out but not entirely extinguished. The newspapers I skimmed each morning over coffee spoke increasingly of soldiers massing along contested borders, of alliances being quietly renegotiated behind closed doors. When my German and French lovers came to call, I noticed their conversation turning, more and more often, away from romance and toward the taut, anxious language of men who sense a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, whether or not they yet have words for what shape it will take. I remember one particular night in a grand hotel room in Berlin, the city glittering coldly beyond the tall windows, when a high-ranking German officer rested his hand at the small of my back and asked me, with an edge in his voice that was not entirely playful, "Greta, if war broke out tomorrow between France and Germany, which side would you stand on?" I looked into his eyes and let the same mysterious smile rise to my lips that I had perfected for 1,000 curious admirers before him. "I stand only with whoever loves me," I told him, "and whoever can afford to pay for the privilege." We both laughed at that, the way people laugh at a joke they have not yet realized as prophecy. But beneath that laughter lay a truth far more frightening than either of us was willing, in that gilded hotel room, to name aloud. The year 1914 was drawing closer with every week that passed, and with it came a war unlike any the world had yet seen, a conflagration that would not merely topple empires and shatter borders, but would, before it was finished, reach into my own golden cage on the Champs-Élysées and tear it apart beam by gilded beam, leaving me with nowhere left to hide from what I had, without ever quite meaning to, become. Chapter 6. The Captain of My Heart. In August of 1914, The silk mask Europe had worn so beautifully for so many years tore away entirely, and beneath it was nothing but bone and gunpowder. I was in Berlin when it happened, in a suite overlooking the Tiergarten, and I remember the particular quality of that first morning with a clarity most memories refuse to give me. The newspaper boys were shouting in the streets below my window before I had even finished my coffee, their voices sharp and urgent in a way I had never heard from them before, and when I leaned out to ask my maid what the commotion meant, her face had already gone pale. Mobilization. The word moved through the city like a fever, and within hours the Berlin I knew, a city of chandeliers and champagne, of officers who bowed low over my hand and murmured compliments in 3 languages, had transformed into something else entirely. Uniforms replaced evening jackets on every corner. Church bells that had once rung for weddings now rang, it seemed, only for departures. I did not understand, that first day, how quickly a beautiful foreign woman becomes a suspicious one. By the second morning, I noticed the change in the eyes of the hotel staff, a wariness where there had once been deference, a hesitation before they would meet my gaze at all. By the third day, 2 officers of the German police arrived at my door without any warning, their boots loud and deliberate on the marble of the corridor outside. I opened the door to find them already past the threshold of politeness, their eyes moving over my rooms with the particular coldness of men conducting an inventory rather than a conversation. They searched everything. I stood in the center of my own sitting room, still in my dressing gown, and watched strangers' hands move through the drawers where I kept my letters, my private things, the small mementos I had carried with me from one glittering city to the next for a decade. They found nothing incriminating because there was nothing to find. I had never once been anything but a dancer and a companion to powerful men, whatever the rumors later made of me. But that did not matter to them. They informed me, in clipped and unapologetic German, that my accounts at the Deutsche Bank had been frozen by order of the state, that a foreign national in wartime Germany could not be trusted with such liquid wealth, and that I would be wise to consider leaving the country before matters grew more difficult for me. I remember standing at that window after they had gone, looking down at the Tiergarten's darkening trees, and understanding with a kind of sick clarity that everything I had built over 10 extraordinary years, the villa, the jewels, the accounts swollen with the gratitude of powerful men, had evaporated in the space of a single week, the way morning fog burns away the moment the sun grows serious about rising. I packed what I could carry in 2 trunks and left the rest behind me, and made my long, anxious way back toward France through a Europe that no longer had any patience for a woman traveling alone and unexplained. Paris, when I finally reached it, was not the city I remembered leaving. The boulevards I had once glided down in a private carriage were now filled with ambulances, their canvas sides stained, rattling toward hospitals that overflowed nightly with boys who had left for the front only weeks before as men. The theaters that had once shouted my name from their marquees now stood dark, their velvet seats empty, their owners gone to the war or gone to ruin. I began to believe, walking those gray and frightened streets, that my season in the sun had ended for good, that Mata Hari, along with so much else that had once seemed permanent in that gilded world, belonged now only to a past the war had already buried. I did not yet know that the truest chapter of my life, the one that would finally teach me what love actually meant, was only just beginning. Evenings by the Seine. His name was Captain Vadim Maslov, though from our very first evening I called him Vladimir, and for the longest while he called me nothing at all. He simply looked at me the way no man ever had before, as though speaking might break whatever fragile thing was settling between us. He was a pilot with the Imperial Russian Army, sent to fly alongside French forces, 21 years old, and possessed of the particular unguarded beauty that belongs only to the very young, a beauty that had not yet learned to calculate its own effect on a room. When our eyes met across the crowded hall of the Grand Hotel, something in me that had gone quiet and hard since Java stirred, unexpectedly, back to life. I was 40 years old. He was barely more than a boy. It should have been an absurdity, and I told myself so, standing there with my champagne glass forgotten in my hand, and yet within the week I found myself walking beside him along the Seine as the autumn light turned the water to hammered copper, unable to remember the last time simply walking beside a man had felt like enough. He spoke of Russia the way other men spoke of women they had loved and lost, with a particular ache beneath the fondness. He told me of his family's estate outside Moscow, of birch forests turned gold in autumn, of a mother who wrote him letters in a hand grown shaky with worry, of snow so deep in winter that the whole world seemed to hold its breath beneath it. "You would find it very cold, Margaretha," he told me one evening, leaning against the stone parapet above the river, using my true name rather than the one Paris had given me, as he always did when he wished to speak to the woman rather than the legend. "But I think you would understand the silence of it. I think you have carried a great deal of silence yourself." I asked him, one night when the wine had loosened something honest in both of us, whether he was afraid to fly. He was quiet for a long moment, watching a barge pass beneath the bridge below us, its lantern swinging gently in the dark. "Every time," he admitted at last. "The engine, the height, the particular sound the wind makes against the wings when you are entirely alone up there with only your own two hands between yourself and the ground. But I have found that fear and joy live very close together in the air, closer than people on the ground ever believe." He turned to look at me then, and there was nothing performed in his gaze at all. "Are you afraid of anything, Mata Hari?" I very nearly gave him the practiced, mysterious answer I gave every man who asked me such questions, some elegant deflection I had polished over a decade of admirers. But something in his open, waiting face stopped the lie in my throat. "I am afraid of growing old," I told him instead, and felt strangely light for having said it aloud. "I have built an entire life on being looked at, Vladimir. I do not know what becomes of a woman like me once the looking stops." He took my hand then, there on the bridge, and pressed it with a gentleness I had not felt from any man since my own mother had last brushed the hair from my face. "Then let me look a while longer," he said, "at the woman underneath the one they applaud for." I do not think I had cried in front of a man since I was 15 years old, standing at a rain-streaked window in The Hague. I very nearly did, that night, above the dark water of the Seine. Every evening after that felt like a small resurrection, long dinners that stretched past midnight, conversations that wandered from his boyhood fears to my buried grief for Non and for Norman, both of which I found myself, astonishingly, able to speak of aloud for the first time in years. In his arms I found something I had been chasing since I was 18 and writing to a stranger in a Dutch newspaper advertisement. Not rescue, for I no longer believed any man capable of that, but a kind of stillness. Wings offered freely, with no chain fastened to either end. The waiting, war, I would learn, reserves its particular cruelty for lovers most of all. Vladimir was called back to the front within weeks, and the city I had only just begun to feel at home in again became, once more, a place of waiting. I do not know how to properly describe those weeks to anyone who has not lived through them. Each morning I woke before the light had fully broken and stood at my window watching the street below, as though Vladimir himself might materialize simply because I willed it hard enough. I read every scrap of war news the papers would print, searching the columns of names, the wounded, the missing, the dead, with a dread so constant it became almost a second pulse beneath my own. I stopped sleeping properly. I stopped, for the first time in a decade, caring much for how I looked when I left the house, because there no longer seemed any point in being beautiful for a city that could not tell me whether the one person I wished to be beautiful for was even still alive. When the telegram finally arrived, I remember that my hands would not stop shaking long enough to open it cleanly. I tore the envelope rather than sliding it, my fingers clumsy and desperate, and stood in my own front hallway reading the same few clinical lines over and over as though repetition might soften what they said. His aircraft had gone down under enemy fire. He had survived. That single mercy nearly buckled my knees with relief, but he lay now in a military hospital at Vittel, gravely wounded, blinded permanently in one eye by a gas attack that had swept the wreckage before help could reach him. I sat down on the floor of my own hallway, still in my dressing gown, and wept in a way I had not allowed myself to weep since Norman's small coffin was lowered into the wet earth of Malong. The bargain! I wanted nothing in the world but to go to him. But Vittel lay within a restricted military zone, closed entirely to civilians, and closed most especially to a foreign woman whose comings and goings had already begun attracting a certain unwelcome official curiosity in wartime Paris. I spent days haunting the anterooms of French military bureaucracy, pleading with clerks who would not meet my eyes, until at last I was shown into the office of a man named Captain Georges Ledoux, head of French counterintelligence. He did not rise when I entered. He simply watched me cross the room and take the chair opposite his desk, his small eyes moving over me with the unhurried thoroughness of a man appraising a horse he was considering purchasing. On the desk between us lay a single sheet of paper, a military travel pass for Vidal, my name already typed neatly across the top of it, close enough that I could read it upside down, and far enough that I could not yet touch it. Madame Mata Hari. He said my stage name deliberately, I think, rather than my true one, a small, calculated cruelty, reminding me which version of myself he had summoned to this room. You wish to see a Russian aviator. I wish to see him today, Captain, if that is within your power to arrange. It is entirely within my power. He let that sentence sit in the air a moment, watching me absorb it. As is a great deal else. His care, for instance. Vital surgeons are competent, but the finest specialists for a wound of that nature are in Paris, and Paris is expensive, and I understand your own accounts were rather thoroughly emptied by our German friends before you left Berlin. You have done your research on me, Captain. It is my occupation to do research on interesting people, madam, and you are among the most interesting Europe currently has to offer. He leaned back in his chair, folding his hands. You dine with German officers. You have dined with them for years, bankers, generals, men who speak rather too freely once the wine has been poured and a beautiful woman is listening with such flattering attention. I do not say this as an accusation. I say it as an observation of your very particular value. You wish me to spy for France. I wish you to continue doing precisely what you have always done so well, he said, and there was something almost gentle in the way he said it, which frightened me far more than bluntness would have. Listen. Charm. Remember what men tell you when they believe no one of consequence is listening. And then, from time to time, share what you have remembered with me. He tapped the travel pass once, lightly, with 2 fingers. In exchange, France will see that your Captain Maslov receives the very best care our surgeons can offer. Consider it, if you like, not payment for services rendered, but simply what one does for a friend in need. I looked down at that pass, and my own name typed so neatly across the top of it, and felt the particular vertigo of standing at the edge of a decision I already knew I could not refuse. I thought of Vladimir's face on the bridge above the Seine, asking me so gently what I was afraid of. I thought of his hand, closing over mine. I understood, with a clarity that made my mouth go dry, exactly what road Ledoux was inviting me to walk, and that I had lived long enough and lost enough to know precisely where such roads generally ended. And if I refuse you, Captain, then I am afraid Vidal's military restrictions must remain exactly as strict as they presently are, he said, without any particular malice, which was somehow worse than if he had shown me any. The war does not pause for love affairs, madam. Not even famous ones. I sat in that hard wooden chair for a long moment, weighing a lifetime of hard-won caution against the memory of Vladimir's voice telling me that fear and joy live very close together. I had promised myself once, standing over Rudolph's cruelty in Java, that I would never again place my fate entirely in a man's hands. And yet here I was, about to place it in the hands of a nation instead, for the sake of a boy of 21 who had simply been kind to me. I picked up the pen Ledoux offered, and I signed my name to the document laid out before me. That day, in the secret files of French intelligence, the name Margaretha Zell ceased to exist entirely. In its place, I was given a new identity, cold and impersonal as a prison number. Agent H, 21. I did not yet understand, setting down that pen, that I had just made my very first bargain with death, and that death, unlike the powerful men who had once showered me with diamonds simply for the privilege of my company, was a creditor who always, eventually, collected in full. Chapter 7. The Double Agent. I carried the military pass to Vidal pressed against my chest the entire journey. as though it might slip from my possession if I loosened my grip on it even once, and by the time I reached the hospital doors, my heart was beating so violently I feared it might be visible through the fabric of my traveling coat. Nothing had prepared me for the sight of him. Vladimir lay propped against a bank of thin pillows, bandages wrapped across half his face, his right eye, the beautiful, dark eye that had once looked at me across a crowded hotel hall with such startled tenderness, gone forever, claimed by the gas that had swept the wreckage before the rescue parties could reach him. When his remaining eye found me in the doorway, I watched it fill slowly with tears, and something in my own chest tore open at the sight, a grief so immediate and so total that I had to grip the doorframe to keep myself upright. I crossed the room and gathered him carefully into my arms, mindful of every bandage, every place where the war had left its mark upon him, and he clung to me with what strength remained in his weakened body as though he were afraid I might dissolve like some wartime mirage the moment he released me. Neither of us spoke for a long while. There are certain griefs, I have learned, that words only diminish, and this was one of them. When at last I found my voice, I made him a promise I had no earthly means yet of keeping. I told him that I would summon the finest physicians in all of Europe to his bedside, that no expense would be spared in restoring whatever could still be restored, that I would not rest until he was whole again, or as whole as this war would permit any of us to become. He pressed my hand against his lips and whispered that he did not deserve such devotion, and I told him, quite truthfully, that devotion of this kind had nothing whatsoever to do with deserving. It had only to do with love, and love, unlike the transactions I had built my entire adult life upon, asked no ledger of me at all. A debt France would not pay. I left Vittel believing, in my naivete, that Captain Ledoux would honor the bargain we had struck in that spare little office in Paris. I had signed my name away, after all, had accepted the cold new identity of Agent H, 21 in exchange for exactly this kind of promise, that France would see to Vladimir's care, that the finest surgeons would be put at his disposal, that my sacrifice would purchase him some measure of comfort in his suffering. I learned, in the weeks that followed, precisely how little a spymaster's promises are worth once he has already secured what he wanted from you. The funds Ledoux had spoken of so generously in his office arrived in trickles, if they arrived at all, always accompanied by some fresh excuse: wartime shortages, bureaucratic delays, the endless grinding machinery of a government at war with itself as much as with Germany. I understood, watching those promised francs fail to materialize month after month, that I had been treated exactly as Rudolph had once treated me, courted with fine words until my usefulness was secured, and abandoned to fend for myself the moment the bargain had been struck. I could not allow Vladimir to suffer for Ledoux's dishonesty. Whatever it cost me, whatever risks I had to run, I resolved that I would find the money myself to give him the care France had promised and failed to deliver. The Ritz in Madrid. It was on Ledoux's own instruction, near the close of 1916, that I traveled to Madrid, Spain remaining, throughout that entire war, a neutral country where French and German officers alike moved freely through the same ballrooms and the same hotel lobbies, watching one another over the rims of their champagne glasses with a wary, unspoken truce. I checked into the Ritz Hotel, and I remember catching my own reflection in the grand mirrors of its lobby and feeling, for one strange moment, as though some drowned version of myself had suddenly resurfaced from very deep water. The war had taken so much from the world by then, had stripped so many cities of their light and their music, and yet within those gilded walls, some fragile echo of the old Europe still survived. My own particular magic, I discovered with some relief, had not entirely deserted me either. It was there that I was introduced to Major Arnold von Colley, the German military attaché stationed in the Spanish capital, a clever man by his own estimation, though I found rather quickly that his cleverness dimmed considerably in the presence of a woman willing to flatter it. He was not unhandsome, nor unintelligent, but he possessed the particular vulnerability common to men who have spent their careers being underestimated by their own superiors and are therefore desperate to prove themselves indispensable to someone. I understood that vulnerability within the first quarter hour of our acquaintance, and I did not waste the advantage it offered me. Within days, He had fallen thoroughly and rather pathetically under my spell. He called on me at all hours, sent flowers I no longer had any real use for, and, most valuably of all, began to speak, in the unguarded hours after midnight, of matters he most certainly should have kept locked behind a soldier's discretion. He spoke of weaknesses in French and British troop positions, of supply routes and reinforcements, the careless confidences of a man so eager to impress a beautiful woman that he had forgotten entirely that beautiful women sometimes remember every word. I noted what he told me as faithfully as I could recall it, intending every syllable for Ledoux's desk in Paris, still believing, foolishly, that loyalty to France might yet be repaid with the funds Vladimir so desperately needed. The trap closes. But Von Kali, for all his eagerness, was not entirely the fool I had first taken him for. Some quiet suspicion must have been working at him beneath the surface of his infatuation, because one evening, in the private dining room of that same grand hotel, he set a different kind of trap before me than the one I had grown accustomed to setting for others. He produced, with a theatrical casualness I recognized at once for what it was, an offer of many thousands of German marks, a sum considerable enough to make my breath catch despite myself, and watched my face closely as he made it. "Madam," he said, turning his wine-glass slowly by its stem, "I am not blind to the fact that French intelligence has taken a certain interest in you. It would not trouble me in the least. I would simply ask that you consider a more profitable arrangement." He smiled, the particular smile of a man who believes he has already won. "Tell us the secret routes of the French shipping convoys. In exchange, this money is yours, enough, I imagine, to keep a wounded young aviator very comfortably indeed." I sat very still, my own wine-glass untouched before me, and felt the entire architecture of my careful, desperate plan shift beneath me like sand. He knew, or if he did not know with certainty, he suspected enough to test me, and the particular cruelty of his test lay in how precisely it was aimed, not at my loyalty to France, which he perhaps rightly guessed was thin, but directly at the one vulnerability he had correctly identified beneath all my practiced mystery. Vladimir's name went unspoken between us, and yet it hung in that private dining room as clearly as if he had shouted it. I told myself, accepting those marks with a steady hand and a smile I had perfected over a decade of far less dangerous negotiations, that I was being clever rather than reckless. I reasoned that I could feed each side stale information, secrets already known or soon to be irrelevant, and collect payment from both France and Germany in the process, enough between the two of them to finally purchase Vladimir's full recovery and vanish with him afterward into some neutral Swiss valley where neither nation's war could ever reach us again. I believed, turning that plan over in my mind late into the Madrid night, that I had found the one clever exit from a trap that had been closing around me since the moment I signed Ledoux's document. I did not understand, not then, what I understand with such terrible clarity now, looking back across the ruin that decision eventually became. I had mistaken myself for a player in a game whose rules I had never been permitted to fully learn. A lamb does not outmaneuver two lions merely by convincing herself she has grown claws. I had become, in the eyes of both nations now watching me, a double agent, a woman playing both sides of a war she had entered for no reason nobler than love, and never once for either country's flag. And somewhere in the shadowed corridors of Paris and Berlin alike, the rifles of two separate governments had already begun, quietly and without my knowledge, to turn themselves toward my chest. Chapter 8. The Fatal Telegram. The suite at the Ritz no longer felt to me like the golden refuge it had seemed on my first evening in Madrid. It had become, in the space of a few short weeks, something closer to a chessboard laid out in silk and velvet, every mirror a vantage point, every closed door a possible ambush, every polite smile exchanged in the hotel corridor a question I could not be entirely certain I had answered correctly. I moved through those beautiful rooms now with the particular wariness of a woman who understands, somewhere beneath her practiced composure, that she has wandered rather further out onto the ice than her own weight can safely bear. The money lay scattered across my bed where I had left it the night before, canvas pouches heavy with German marks, more currency than I had held in my hands at any single moment since the war began stripping fortunes from women like myself with the same indifference it stripped the leaves from the trees along the Unter den Linden. I picked up one of the pouches and turned it slowly in my palm, and I remember being struck by how cold the coins felt through the fabric, how strangely heavy for something that was, in the end, only metal and promise. I told myself that this weight was salvation. I told myself that every mark in that pouch was one step closer to the finest surgeon in Switzerland, one step closer to a quiet house somewhere the war could not reach, one step closer to Vladimir's ruined eye healing as much as any eye could heal, and to the two of us vanishing together into some ordinary, unglamorous happiness I had never once, in my entire adult life, permitted myself to imagine wanting. I sat at the edge of that bed for a long while, running my fingers over the cool canvas, and let myself build the whole fantasy in my mind as though building it carefully enough might make it true. A little house with green shutters. Mountains instead of opera houses. Vladimir reading to me in the evenings in that low, unhurried voice he used only when he had forgotten, for a moment, to be careful with me. I thought of Norman's grave in Java and Nance's face I could no longer clearly picture, and told myself that this money, however dishonestly earned, however dangerous its source, was the closest thing to redemption fate had yet offered a woman who had lost nearly everything else worth keeping. I did not examine, in that gilded Madrid bedroom, how very thin such reasoning was. I have had a great deal of time since to examine it instead, and I have come to understand that a woman blinded by love makes precisely the same mistakes as a woman blinded by anything else. She simply makes them with a more beautiful conviction. The betrayal on the wire. I did not witness what happened next with my own eyes, though I have since reconstructed it so many times in memory that it sometimes feels as though I did. In a spare, unremarkable office elsewhere in that same city, Major Arnold von Colley sat before his wireless apparatus in the final days of December, composing a message bound for his superiors in Berlin with the calm, methodical patience of a man who has already decided precisely how a particular game must end. He was not, whatever I had allowed myself to believe in our more intimate hours together, a man who mistook affection for loyalty. He had understood, likely from the very evening he first tested me with his offer of marks and shipping routes, that I was already compromised in France's service, that whatever secrets I passed him were stale currency, coins already spent long before they reached his hand. He composed his message that evening with particular care, choosing for it not his most secure cipher, but an older code, the H-21 cipher, which he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who has studied his enemy's methods as closely as his own. French intelligence had already broken months before. He did not trouble himself to disguise this choice as an oversight. It was, I have come to believe, a deliberate cruelty, precise as a surgeon's incision. The message he sent into the winter air above Madrid read, in its essential substance, that a German agent designated H-21 had arrived in the city and provided valuable French secrets, and that this same agent was now being furnished with 15,000 pesetas and returned to Paris to continue her work. Every word of it was calculated for exactly one purpose, not to inform Berlin of anything Berlin did not already know, but to be intercepted. Von Colley understood precisely what awaited any spy foolish enough to work against the interests of a nation growing desperate and humiliated in a war it was no longer certain of winning. He was not offering me up as a rival. He was offering me up as a sacrifice, a convenient scapegoat whose public unmasking would sow chaos through French intelligence and quietly obscure the far more damaging leaks his own government had no wish to have traced any further. I was, in the coldest and most literal sense, expendable, a beautiful diversion to be discarded the moment her usefulness as a diversion outweighed her usefulness as a lover. I knew nothing of this, of course, as I packed my trunks in Madrid with a foolish, private happiness rising in my chest for the first time in months. I folded silk gowns I no longer had much occasion to wear and told myself, refastening the clasps of my jewelry case, that I would soon deliver Berlin's stale secrets to Ledoux, collect whatever fee France still owed me, and vanish from this entire dangerous chessboard forever with Vladimir at my side. I did not yet know that somewhere above me, In the invisible currents of the winter air, my own death sentence was already traveling toward Paris considerably faster than my train. A city turned to ice. When my train finally drew into the station in the first week of January 1917, snow was falling in slow, indifferent flurries over a Paris that felt, from the very moment I stepped onto the platform, subtly and unmistakably wrong. The city had always worn its moods openly for me before. I had known its gaiety, its hunger, its fear. But this was something new, a peculiar hush that had settled over even its grandest boulevards, as though the whole capital were holding its breath around some secret it had not yet decided to share with me. I took my usual suite at the Hotel Plaza Athénée, and it was there, within my very first hours back, that I began to feel the change most acutely. The doormen who had once bowed with such warm familiarity now offered only stiff, correct little nods, their eyes sliding away from mine a beat too quickly to be accidental. On the street, acquaintances who would once have crossed traffic simply to press my hand now found sudden urgent business in shop windows the moment they recognized my carriage. I sent word to Captain Ledoux requesting an audience, certain that whatever coldness I sensed elsewhere would surely dissolve the moment I sat once more across from the man who had made me his agent. His office returned no reply at all. Not that week, nor the next. The great men who had once filled my drawing room with diamonds and confessions found their doors closed to me one by one. Ministers suddenly too occupied for visitors, generals abroad on urgent business, bankers whose secretaries regretted to inform me that no appointment could presently be arranged. I told myself, in those first bewildering days, that the war had simply hardened Paris past recognizing its own former pleasures, that the whole city had grown too weary and too frightened for romance of any kind. I did not yet understand that French intelligence had already intercepted and decoded von Colley's telegram, that my own name, the true one, Margaretha Gertrude Zell, alongside the stage name the whole world knew so well, was already circulating through military offices with a very different word attached to it: traitor. I did not yet know that a nation hemorrhaging young men at the front, humiliated by losses it could not fully explain to its own grieving mothers, had found in me precisely the scapegoat it required, a beautiful, foreign, inconvenient woman, easily sacrificed to a public desperate for someone, anyone, to blame. I remember lying awake in my hotel room on the night of the 12th of February, staring at my own reflection in the dressing mirror across the room, and feeling, with a dread I could not yet name but could not shake either, that the particular light that had always lived behind my eyes, the light that had once conquered an entire hall at the Musée Grémet, had finally, quietly, begun to go out. The knock. At precisely 6 o'clock on the morning of the 13th of February, 1917, a hard, deliberate knocking shattered the silence of my hotel room. I rose from a bed I had not properly slept in and crossed the cold floor in my dressing gown, my bare feet numb against the marble, some instinct already tightening in my chest before my hand had even closed around the door handle. When I opened it, Commissioner Pierre Prilot stood in the corridor beyond, flanked by armed officers whose presence filled the narrow hallway with a silence far more terrible than any shouting could have been. "Margaretha Gertrude Zell," he said, in a voice utterly without warmth, without apology, without the faintest trace of the admiration Paris had once shown me so freely. "Known also as Mata Hari. You are under arrest, on charges of espionage and treason against France." I do not remember deciding to hold out my wrists. I remember only the cold, terrible weight of the iron as it closed around them, heavier by far than any jewel a general or a banker had ever fastened there, and the particular finality of that small metallic click, as though a door somewhere deep inside my own chest had shut for the very last time. I looked past the commissioner's shoulder, out through the tall window of my suite, and saw that the Paris sky beyond the glass had turned the deep, bruised red of a wound just beginning to bleed. Somewhere behind that crimson horizon, the sun was rising, the same sun whose name I had claimed for my own so many years before, on a veranda in Java, certain it would one day blind the entire world with its light. I did not yet know, standing there in chains as dawn broke blood-red over the rooftops of Paris, that this particular sunrise was the last one Mata Hari would ever be permitted to watch as a free woman. Chapter 9. The Cage and the Crucifixion. I had spent nearly a quarter-century learning how to walk into a room and command it, how to make silk and candlelight and my own careful mystery bend an entire hall to my will. Nothing in that education had prepared me for the particular violence of walking, in a single morning, from the gilded corridors of the Plaza Athénée into the stone bowels of St. Lazare prison. They gave me cell 12, and I have never in my life known cold the way I came to know it in that room. It was not the clean, bracing cold of a Dutch winter, nor even the damp chill of the boarding house I had shared with my mother after my father's ruin. This was a cold that lived inside the stone itself, that seeped up through the thin straw pallet and settled directly into the marrow, as though the building had been designed by some architect of despair specifically to remind a woman, hour after hour, precisely how far she had fallen. A single military blanket, coarse and moth-eaten, was all I was given against it, and I wrapped myself in that thin wool each night and thought, with a bitterness too exhausted even to be sharp anymore, of the silk sheets I had once considered an ordinary comfort rather than a luxury. There was no mirror in that cell, and I came, in time, to be grateful for its absence. I could not see what the weeks were doing to me, though I could feel it plainly enough in the sharpening of my own cheekbones beneath my fingers, in the way my once lustrous hair had begun to hang lank and dull against my neck, in the particular hollow ache behind my eyes that no amount of sleep, and sleep came rarely enough in that place, seemed able to ease. I've went weeks without a proper bath, and the woman who had once been photographed by every fashionable studio in Paris, who had made an entire continent forget itself simply by lifting her arms above her head, learned instead the indignities of vermin in the straw and the particular echoing loneliness of nights broken only by the scurrying of rats along the corridor beyond my door. And yet, even buried in that filth and cold, some small ember refused entirely to go out. I would lie awake on that thin pallet, staring into a darkness, so complete it seemed to have texture, and think of Vladimir. I told myself, night after night, that he would come. That the moment word reached him of my arrest, whatever obligations the war still held him to would fall away beneath the force of everything we had shared above the Seine, on that bridge where he had taken my hand and asked to look a while longer at the woman beneath the legend. I did not yet understand how thoroughly that particular hope would be crushed, nor how soon. In those bleak early weeks, it was the only warmth St. Lazare permitted me, and I clung to it the way a drowning woman clings to driftwood, without once asking whether the wood itself might already be rotten through. The prosecutor's trap. Captain Pierre Bouchardon arrived to interrogate me with a particular relish of a man who has already decided your guilt and considers the proceedings that follow merely a formality to be endured before the satisfying conclusion. He was a military prosecutor by trade and a moralist by temperament, and I understood within the first quarter hour of our acquaintance that he despised not merely the accusations leveled against me, but the entire manner of woman he believed me to be, independent, foreign, unashamed of the particular freedoms my art and my beauty had purchased me. He questioned me for hours at a stretch, day after day, in a bare room lit by a single unforgiving lamp, circling the same accusations again and again from slightly altered angles, watching for the moment my exhaustion might cause some fatal inconsistency to slip free. He seemed to take a special, almost gleeful satisfaction in resurrecting the story I had once spun for Paris's high society, the sacred temple dancer born in the south of India, orphaned by tragedy, trained by priests in ancient and holy mysteries. "You lied to all of Paris for over a decade, Margaretha," he said to me one afternoon, striking his fist against the table with enough force to make the lamp shudder. "You convinced an entire nation that you were something you were never remotely close to being. What manner of woman constructs such an elaborate deception about her very identity, if not a woman entirely practiced in the art of betrayal? You are no dancer, madam. You are a femme fatale who wove French generals into your bed and sold what you learned there to the enemy." I told him, as steadily as my exhausted voice would allow, that the fiction I had built around my own origins had harmed no one but myself, that a poor woman's invented mystery was hardly a crime against the state, whatever moral objection he wished to raise against it. I told him, again and again until my throat ached with the repetition, that whatever information I had passed to Von Colley in Madrid had been stale and worthless, secrets already known to French intelligence long before I ever repeated them, and that the marks I had accepted from him had been intended for one purpose only: Vladimir's care, his surgeries, his slow and painful recovery from wounds this same war had inflicted upon him in France's own service. Bouchardon did not want to hear it. He wanted his traitor, tidy and photogenic and already half-condemned in the newspapers before his own tribunal had even convened, and he shaped every question, every twisted repetition of my own words, toward that single predetermined conclusion. I came to understand, in that bare interrogation room, a truth no courtroom would ever say aloud, that a friendless, foreign woman's voice carried no real weight at all in a tribunal built entirely by men, for men, to protect a nation's wounded pride rather than to discover any actual truth. The betrayal. My court-martial opened behind closed doors on the 24th of July, 1917, and I remember entering that chamber with something almost like resolve, believing that whatever else might be taken from me, the truth of my own heart would surely be permitted to speak in my defense. I watched, with a slow and sickening recognition, as the witnesses were called. Ministers who had once knelt at the edge of my bed now sat stiffly in the gallery and claimed, with barely concealed discomfort, only the faintest and most formal of acquaintances with me. Generals who had once whispered their nation's secrets into my hair now would not so much as meet my eyes across the courtroom. And Captain Georges Ledoux himself, the very man who had placed that travel pass on his desk and turned me into Agent H-21 with his own hand, sat before the tribunal and denied, with a composure that still turns my stomach to recall, that he had ever given me any mission whatsoever. The man who had built the trap now claimed never to have said it. But it was not their betrayal that finally broke whatever remained unbroken in me. It was Vladimir's. I had believed, in some small, foolish chamber of my heart I had not yet learned to protect, that he alone would stand for me, that whatever the tribunal decided, he would at least testify to what we had truly shared above the dark water of the Seine, the birch forests and the fear of flying, and the promise to look a while longer at the woman beneath the legend. When the government's advocate rose instead to read his written statement into the record, I remember gripping the edge of the wooden dock so tightly my knuckles went white, still certain, even then, that some declaration of love was coming. It was not love that was read aloud that afternoon. Vladimir's own words, delivered in that flat courtroom voice, declared that he had held no deep attachment to Margaretha Zell whatsoever, that she had been, in his own phrase, merely an aging international courtesan, a passing fancy for a handful of nights, and that he claimed no connection at all to any woman accused of working against France. I do not have adequate words, even now, for what happened inside me in that moment. It was not merely grief. Grief I had already survived a dozen times over, my mother, my son, my daughter, my own girlhood. This was something closer to a death of the soul itself, swift and silent and absolute. The man for whom I had bargained away my very name, who had held my hand above the Seine and asked to see the woman the world refused to look past its own legend to find, had discarded me in a single written sentence to preserve his own uniform and his own standing. I did not weep in that courtroom. I discovered, sitting in that wooden dock with the whole chamber's eyes upon me, that my heart had gone somewhere beyond the reach of tears altogether, that love itself had revealed its final face to me as simply one more elegant deception, and that I had become, in the end, its most complete and thorough casualty. The verdict, the tribunal had, by then, already been given precisely what it had come searching for. Without any true evidence beyond suspicion and the damning shadow of that Madrid wireless code, the judges retired briefly and returned with a verdict already written, in every sense that mattered, long before I had ever entered that courtroom. The presiding judge rose, his voice grave and final. Margaretha Gertrude Zell, this tribunal finds you guilty of espionage against France and complicit in the deaths of thousands of French soldiers. You are sentenced to death by firing squad. A silence fell over that chamber so complete I could hear my own attorney's hand trembling against the wood of the table beside me. And yet, In that darkest of moments, something old and unbroken stirred awake inside me. The same stubborn dignity that had once carried a frightened, orphaned girl out of a headmaster's grasping arms and into a life she had built entirely from her own audacity. I straightened my spine, lifted my hollowed eyes to meet the gaze of every judge upon that bench, and let the faintest, most mysterious of smiles rise to my lips, the very smile that had once conquered the grandest hall in Paris. They had taken my freedom. They had crushed my love and stripped my name of every fiction I had ever woven around it. But they would never, whatever bullets awaited me, manage to bow my soul. Mata Hari had always been destined to meet her end before the barrel of a gun. I understood, rising from that wooden dock with my chin held high, that I was finally, terribly ready to meet it. Chapter 10. The Last Kiss. The morning of the 15th of October, 1917, arrived cold enough to still the breath in my chest before I had even fully opened my eyes. I had been half waiting for it for weeks, in the particular way one waits for a storm one can already smell on the wind, and so when the great iron door of St. Lazare groaned open at precisely 4 o'clock, I did not need the sister's tear-streaked face or my lawyer's trembling hands to tell me what had finally arrived. I understood at the moment I heard the weight of those hinges. The President of the Republic had refused my petition for clemency. There would be no further mercy extended to me in this life. The prison chaplain's assistant, a young nun with kind, frightened eyes, could not stop weeping long enough to help me dress, and my attorney stood in the corner of that cold cell with his hat crushed between his hands, unable to meet my gaze at all. I remember feeling, strangely, the calmest I had felt in months, a peculiar, settled stillness, as though some enormous weight I had been carrying without fully realizing its size had finally, in this last extremity, been set down. The world that had given me nothing but grief and betrayal and poverty dressed up, now and then, in silk was about to release me from its grip entirely. I found, standing in that gray cell in the last hour of my life, that I was not half so afraid of leaving it as I had once believed I would be. I would not go to my death looking like a broken, forgotten prisoner. I told the sister, as gently as I could manage through her tears, that I was a dancer, that I had spent my whole life being watched, and that I did not intend to let the final audience I would ever face see anything less than exactly what Paris itself had once fallen in love with. I selected, from what little remained of my wardrobe, a beautifully tailored suit of deep blue silk, the fabric still holding some faint ghost of the perfumes and grand hotels it had once known. I drew on a pair of fine leather gloves, slipped my feet into delicate sandals rather than the coarse boots the prison might otherwise have offered me, and stood before the cell's bare stone wall. There was no mirror, and I did not need one, arranging my hair from memory alone, my fingers moving with the same practiced grace they had once used to pin jeweled headdresses before 1,000 admiring eyes. I painted my lips with the last of a deep red color I had kept hidden among my few possessions, applying it slowly and with great care, as though preparing for the most important performance of my life. In a sense, I understood I was Mata Hari's ending, I told myself, watching my own hands move with a steadiness that surprised even me, would be a work of art, exactly as her entrance into the world had been. The field at Vincennes. The motor cars carried me out through Paris's gray morning streets toward the military grounds at Vincennes, and I remember watching the city slide past the window with a strange, dreamlike detachment. The same boulevards I had once glided down in my own private carriage, the same grand hotels where I had once been fought over by ministers and generals, all of it passing now in complete silence, wrapped in a fog thick enough to blur every familiar edge into something almost unrecognizable. When the cars finally stopped, the mist lay so heavy across the open field that the world seemed to end only a short distance in every direction, as though the whole of France had shrunk, for this single hour, down to the size of that one bare stretch of ground. 12 French soldiers stood assembled in a precise, silent line, their rifles already resting against their shoulders, their young faces arranged into the careful blankness of men who have been ordered not to feel whatever it is they are about to do. Officers stood at a respectful distance, along with a small company of drummers whose instruments hung silent and ready at their sides, waiting for whatever signal would set the whole grim ceremony into motion. I was led across that damp grass toward a simple wooden post driven into the earth, and I walked it, I am told, without once faltering, my chin lifted, my gloved hands folded before me exactly as my own mother had once taught a small girl in Leeuwarden to stand when the whole world seemed to be watching. An officer approached me carrying a strip of white cloth, intended, as was customary, to cover my eyes against the sight of what was coming. I raised my hand and refused it. "Take that away," I told him, and I remember my own voice sounding steadier in that moment than it had in weeks, as though some last reserve of the old defiance had finally risen up to meet this final test. I have never once looked away from a man in my life. I will not begin on the morning I am asked to die. I looked past him, toward the line of rifles waiting in the mist. "Let me see them clearly." A murmur of visible surprise passed through the officers standing witness. They moved next to bind me to the post itself, as procedure required, and I shook my head at that as well, with the same quiet, unshakable dignity. I would not be tied like cattle awaiting slaughter. I stood instead entirely on my own 2 feet, unbound, unblindfolded, my spine straight as the post beside me, and waited. What I remembered. The commander lifted his sword, and the 12 rifles rose as one, their barrels finding their mark against my chest with a terrible, mechanical precision. I remember, in that final suspended moment, understanding with perfect clarity that I stood only a handful of feet from the very end of everything I had ever been, the orphaned girl from Leeuwarden, Rudolph's battered young wife, the temple dancer who had conquered an entire hall in Paris with nothing but silk and stolen mystery, the desperate lover who had signed away her own name to save a man who would, in the end, disown her before a courtroom of strangers. And in that final breath before the command was given, it was not Vladimir's face that rose up before me, nor Rudolph's cruel and reddened one. I thought instead of the tulip fields of Leeuwarden in spring, their colors so vivid it seemed almost impossible now, viewed across the distance of an entire lifetime. I thought of my mother's gentle hands drawing a brush through my hair, her soft voice promising that my eyes would carry me very far from home. I thought of the temple dancers of Java, moving through torchlight with such sacred, unhurried grace, and of the name they had unknowingly given me, Eye of the Day, a name I had carried further across the world than any of them could ever have imagined. And beneath all of it, quiet and constant as a heartbeat, I thought of Non, my small, solemn daughter, whose face I had not been permitted to hold against my own in more years than I cared to count, and whom I would now never have the chance to embrace again in this life. The commander's voice cut through the mist, sharp and final. "Prepare." 12 fingers tightened against 12 triggers, and in that last suspended fraction of a second, with death standing so close I could feel its particular silence pressing against my chest, I found that I did not wish to leave this world in fear, nor in grief, nor in the bitter fury I might once have believed I owed the men who had brought me to this field. I lifted my gloved hand slowly to my painted lips, and I blew one last, unhurried kiss out across that misted ground toward the row of rifles waiting to end me, my final word to a world of men who had loved me, used me, betrayed me, and finally condemned me, offered back to them not in hatred, but in the same mysterious, unbroken grace I had spent my whole life perfecting. Fire. 12 rifles spoke together, a single tremendous roar that shattered the silence of that gray field. I felt the silk of my beautiful blue suit tear, felt the impact drive through me with a violence that was, in its own strange way, almost merciful in how quickly it arrived. My knees folded slowly beneath me, and I sank down into the wet grass of Vincennes, but even as the world tilted and dimmed around me, I kept my face lifted toward that pale, fog-shrouded sky, and I do not believe, in that very last moment, that the small, knowing smile ever once left my lips. They could take my body. They had already taken my freedom, my love, my name, and nearly everything else this cruel and beautiful world had ever allowed me to hold. But they could not, in the end, take Mata Hari herself, the woman I had built, with my own 2 hands, out of nothing but grief and silk and sheer unbending will, in defiance of every cage this world had ever tried to build around me. The guns of Paris silenced a woman on that cold October morning. But history, in its own strange and lasting mercy, has never once managed to silence the legend she left standing in her place. The end.